Now, I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon to this talk on Theosophy and the Christmas message. And I've been a bit nervous about this, and not only because of Oxford Street traffic and phones that won't switch off and pockets that won't open, but because what I have to say is somewhat controversial. I don't remember ever saying it before in the lecture. I'm not entirely sure I've ever heard it before in a lecture. But certain sections of this talk are not commonly said from theosophical platforms, although indirectly they form an important part of theosophical teaching. First of all, I'll just explain this cartoon, which some of you may be puzzled by. The ancient Romans celebrated a festival around the 21st of December in honour of the god Saturn, and they called it Saturnalia. Now, it was a gloomy time of the year, and so they cheered themselves up by celebrations, probably with a bit of alcohol and so on. And that's what the cartoon's about. Someone is hoping that no other religion comes along and co-opts it. But of course, in the 4th century of the Christian era, the Bishop of Rome decided to establish an official celebration of the birthday of Jesus on the 25th of December, which is right in the middle of the Saturnalia. It was, in fact, a takeover bid. Now, not all parts of the Christian church agreed with that, particularly the Eastern churches, and that's why in the Eastern churches, Christmas is still often celebrated later than that, and in particular the 6th of January, what in the Western church was called Epiphany, was a favourite occasion. The Theosophical Society was formed, as you know, in New York in 1875. It's always been especially interested in the inner meaning of religious teachings. As one of the founders, Madame Blavatsky, put it in her greatest work, The Secret Doctrine. The secret doctrine, she said, is the accumulated wisdom of the ages. It is the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers whose respective experiences were made to test and to verify the traditions passed orally by one early race to another, and of the teachings of higher and exalted beings who watched over the child of humanity. Now, bear that in mind when you hear one or two controversial things in a few minutes. In 1875, as now, the Christmas festival was widely celebrated, though not by all Christians. This is because, although the Christian scriptures record the birth of Jesus Christ, they do not state the season of the year. This is in contrast to the death of Jesus, which is dated to the season of the Jewish Passover, spring in the Northern Hemisphere. So some Christians do not observe Christmas. And indeed, after the English Civil War in 1656, legislation was enacted to ensure that though every Sunday was stringently observed as a holy day, the Lord's Day, by contrast, shops and markets were told to stay open on the 25th of December. And in the City of London, soldiers were ordered to patrol the streets, seizing any food they discovered being prepared for Christmas celebrations. With the return of the monarchy in 1660, Christmas was restored in England. But of course it is dangerous today to celebrate it publicly in a number of countries. The question arises, should Theosophists observe Christmas? After all, this may involve external religious practices. William Judge, one of the founders of the TS, was asked this question, and he responded, "One who accumulates the pure honey of sincerity may just as well join in Christmas festivities in Christendom as he would in those of Buddha's birthday in Ceylon." But worship of Jesus seems to have started very early among the Christians. It was Paul, for example, who was acclaimed by Madame Blavatsky as an initiate, and who also valued so much the gifts of the Spirit, who prayed that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven, things in earth, and things under the earth. Some biblical scholars, and indeed some Theosophists, may argue that angels may have appeared and prophets may have prophesied, but they've been misreported if they've been credited with exalted language about Jesus. But let's turn to the most controversial aspect of Theosophy's response to the Christmas message. Many Theosophical leaders have taught that Jesus lived about 100 BC, 100 years before the accepted date, before Christ, and that he was not crucified but was stoned, and they identify him with Jeshu ben Bandera, someone in Jewish tradition. Now this effectively undercuts Orthodox Christianity. If there was no suffering under Pontius Pilate around AD 30, around 30 in the Christian era, then there was no conventional atonement. And if the New Testament can be wrong on so important a matter as the date and manner of death of its main character, then its reliability would be low. The 100 BC theory, and the precise date is sometimes given differently, like 105 BC. This theory was introduced by H.P. Blavatsky in her first book, Isis Unveiled. And she cited there a French occultist, Eliphas Levi, in a French book, La Séance des Esprits, published in 1865, where Levi printed medieval Jewish accounts which suggested that Jesus had actually lived about 100 years before Christ and had been stoned. Incidentally, Levi's book has still, to this day, not been translated. Although she did not always commit herself to the 100 BC theory, HPB did endorse it in several places, notably in 1887 in 2 articles about the esoteric character of the Gospels, and on another article in French in response to a paper by the Abbé Rocca on the esotericism of Christian dogma. Among the scholars she cited in support was Gerald Massey, but she added, "Our masters affirm the statement." We also find that the Eastern Masters directly supported the 100 BC theory in their letters, though the references are not as full as might be wished for such a significant matter. Kuthumi, for example, a very important teacher in Theosophy, spoke of John the Baptist having never heard of Jesus, who is a spiritual abstraction and low-living man of that epoch. Earlier, in the Mahatma letters, the man Jeshu is called but a mortal like any of us, an adept more by his inherent purity and ignorance of real evil than by what he had learned with his initiated rabbis and the already, at that period, fast degenerating Egyptian hierophants and priests. In 1881, also, Kuthumi wrote footnotes to some articles by Eliphas Levi and said of the doctrine of Jesus, both public and private, but he preached it a century before his birth. Now, whether Levi himself subscribed to this theory, I do not know, because despite 2 recent biographies in English, he remains a rather obscure character. And in other books, he spoke derisively of this 100 BC theory, although that may have been to avoid legal trouble. The theory about Jesus became entangled, in France especially, with anti-clericalism, politics, anti-Semitism, and occult streams which are little known in the English world, or to Theosophists generally. Among later Theosophists, Gottfried DePeruca, the leader of the Point Loma Theosophical Society, was firm in support of the theory. His comments in 1934 about the real birth date of Jesus included in his book Studies in Occult Philosophy, were, "The statement is made from our esoteric records, but these esoteric records are also largely based on astronomical and genuinely astrological wisdom." He added that each messianic cycle of about 2,160 years had its own Messiah, and the Messiah of the present messianic cycle was the power, the influence working through HPB. Annie Besant popularised the 100 BC theory in her book Esoteric Christianity. In the chapter on the historical Christ, she said, "The child whose Jewish name has been turned into that of Jesus was born in Palestine BC 105. Eventually," she said, "the human body of Jesus paid the penalty for enshrining the glorious presence of a teacher more than man," apparently a reference to stoning by other Jews. On the left here you'll see Annie Besant, and on the right you'll see C.W. Leadbeater. Mrs. Besant enjoyed the clairvoyant assistance of C.W. Leadbeater on this matter, as on others. Though, as made clear above, the 100 BC theory is not a later development of Theosophy, but entered early. Leadbeater characteristically quoted esoteric Christianity in his own book, The Christian Creed, in which also the theory of a greater master, Christ, possessing Jesus, is deployed. In expounding the creedal statement, the statement in the Christian Creed that Jesus was crucified, dead and buried, Leadbeater was obliged to explain it as an allegory, while Pontius Pilate, historical though he was, the Roman governor of Judea, was held to have got into the story by mistranslation. Thus Leadbeater. In the background for both these writers, Besant and Leadbeater, was clairvoyant research carried out at the turn of the century in cooperation with G.R.S. Mead, the Theosophical scholar with a special interest in Christian origins. A valuable description of this research was given by Mr. Janardha Dasa in his book Occult Investigations. It is, of course, only one chapter in the investigations that Besant and Leadbeater made, the most famous perhaps being in occult chemistry. Janardha Dasa pointed out that Mead, in the end, lost all faith in the veracity of the investigations. This was after he'd left the Theosophical Society in 1909 and had developed doubts about his colleagues in other respects. Mead himself alluded guardedly to the clairvoyant experiments in his book Did Jesus Live 100 Years BC?, which was a careful account of the Jewish and early Christian material relevant to the question. Speaking of the occult researchers with whom he worked, he observed, "Now, this handful of friends of mine who are endowed in this special fashion are unanimous in declaring that Yeshu, the historical Jesus, lived a century before the traditional date." Mead gives the impression that there were several researchers, but I suspect it was mainly Leadbeater. Mead did not commit himself in the end of the book, and he made no appeal to the authority of the masters. Another theosophist of the time, who did eventually claim a Mahatmic source for most of her work, DK, was Alice Bailey. She taught much that was congenial to the theosophy of her day. She sometimes cited Mrs. Besant, and she was aware of the symbolical value of the life of Jesus, with the crucifixion, for example, being a particular initiation for disciples. But she apparently had no interest in the 100 BC theory, and she accepted the traditional date. But Dr. Rudolf Steiner, who for over a decade was General Secretary of the German Theosophical Society, directly, indeed forcefully, challenged the theory. Claiming his own occult lineage, claiming also a capacity to read the Akashic records, Dr. Steiner dated the crucifixion as the 3rd of April, AD 33, and he identified Jeshu ben Pandira as indeed a forerunner and herald of Jesus of Nazareth, but not the same person. Pandira had supposedly lived a century before him and was indeed a very important individuality. In fact, said Steiner, he was the current holder of the rank of Bodhisattva in the Theosophical scheme, but not the same as Christ Jesus. And for good measure, Steiner added that Jeshu ben Pandira was again in incarnation, preparing for the new perception of the etheric Christ in the 20th century. Some of you will know that there are two different sets of stories about the birth of Jesus, some in the Gospel of Matthew and some in the Gospel of Luke. Some people think that the Gospel of Matthew is Joseph, the father, the supposed father's version of the story, and that the Gospel of Luke presents the supposed view of Mary. Two different sets of birth stories. Dr. Steiner argued that there were in fact two different Jesus children, one of whom did not survive to adulthood, but there was a connection between these two. Now this is a highly controversial suggestion. It's not unique to Steiner, but it's certainly, shall we say, unusual among theosophical writers. It's so controversial that when, about 60 years ago, an Anglican clergyman, Canon Shepherd, wrote a book, A Scientist of the Invisible, commending Steiner to his fellow Christians, he couldn't bring himself to mention the two Jesus theory. But the two Jesus theory does have a very modest amount of support, and one of the ways in which it is supported is through a number of paintings. We won't have time to go into that today, however. To return to the general idea that Jesus had lived 100 BC, Mr. Junada Dasa, who later became president of the Theosophical Society, as a young man had been present at the clairvoyant investigations by Leadbeater, and he remained interested in the 100 BC theory to the end of his life. And when he was reviewing a book on biblical criticism in the Theosophist in 1950, he still argued that the events had probably taken place very much earlier than the period narrated. And in the July 1950 issue, he returned to the theory and suggested that the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947, supported the belief that the Essenes had had a Messiah who'd been killed 100 years before the crucifixion. And he wasn't the last theosophical leader to take a personal interest in the theory, and it still surfaces, both in expositions of HPB's teachings and in those of her successors. In the Theosophist for April 1985, for example, Miss Rosamunda Pryor, exploring the meaning today of gospel truth, noted, "Occult tradition with regard to the life of Jesus states that he lived 100 years before the received date and was murdered at Lyd about 70 BC. However, a somewhat severe judgment on this theory is found in Gregory Tillet's biography of Leadbeater, the elder brother, in 1982, and Dr. Tillett wrote, "There is not a single reputable biblical scholar, archaeologist or historian who supports this claim, and on the basis of modern research, there is no reason to seriously question the traditional date for the birth of Jesus at about 5 BC. As we have seen, however, the theory was not invented by Leadbeater and has been held by persons at an opposite pole to him in theosophical thought. It is true, so far as I am aware, that the 100 BC theory has not found any definite takers among biblical scholars. Even Jewish reference works accept the conventional dating. So independent a scholar as Professor Morton Smith, whose book Jesus the Magician in 1978 was of great interest to the student, accepted the fact that Jesus was executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Noting the confusion produced in rabbinic material, that's material written by Jewish rabbis about 2,000 years ago, confusion produced by several factors, he said. First, the rabbis were generally ignorant of chronology and constantly guilty of absurd anachronisms. Secondly, they habitually refer to their enemies by abusive nicknames and puns, usually bad. And thirdly, in the case of Jesus particularly, this practice of concealed reference has been carried to the extreme by manuscript copyists to avoid censorship. However, it may be that biblical scholars are confused by the material through not realising esoteric levels to it that would make it much clearer. And the mainstream labours of biblical scholars who accept the usual date have not resulted in a genuinely convincing interpretation of Jesus. When I was a student, I was taught biblical studies by Dr. John Bowden of SCM Press, who translated many books from German into English. Near the end of his life, he wrote a book on Jesus. And chapter by chapter, he shows how different scholars, depending usually on their personal predilections, come out with a different picture of what Jesus was like. So there's no generally accepted view among scholars. What we need, of course, is a re-examination of the evidence that updates the scholarship from the time of G.S. Mead a century ago to the present. And with all respect to those who stand by occult tradition, unless this is done, the case for the theory will partly go by default. Indeed, it becomes one person's reading of the Akashic records, or otherwise secret records, set against another. The theory is not, however, crucial for a Gnostic or esoteric interpretation of Jesus. It possibly became known to Jewish students of the Kabbalah several hundred years ago, was then transmitted to Gentile students, and was passed on by some Western occultists to their Oriental colleagues. And we can see how both HBB and KH could have come to support it. But should we accept it today without more study? Too much rests upon it for it to be a passing reference in the teachings. But let us now turn to other aspects of the theosophical understanding of Christmas. Dr. DePeruca of Point Loma, whom we cited in support of the 100 BC date, said of Jesus, and I quote, Avatara, that's avatar, Avatara is a Sanskrit word. It means the descent of a divine being, not into human flesh, but as it were towards incarnation in human flesh. It means the overshadowing, or more correctly speaking, the over-illuminating of some great and noble man by a divinity, by a god. So that, to use ordinary language, an avatara is an incarnate god because the noble human, so chosen, expresses through himself some more or less large part of the over-illuminator. Jesus, went on Dr. Peruca, Jesus was an avatara, a manifestation through the form of a human being, of a god, of a divinity, one of the spiritual beings controlling our part of the stellar universe. And this exalted teaching was worked out by Dr. Peruca in some detail. In addition, the Point Loma community, under his leadership in the 1930s, held seasonal rituals at the solstices and the equinoxes at which esoteric teaching was given. But the teaching at the winter solstice was chiefly about the meaning of the Buddha. Oh. This is the moment in the slide presentation when the lecturer gets lost. But I've now found myself. Where all the theosophical traditions come together is the emphasis on the inner meaning of Christianity, rather than the historical basis. And as early as 1883, Dr. Anna Kingsford, one of the first British women to qualify as a doctor, medical doctor, was elected as the first woman to be president of the British Theosophical Society. And she said, "I have always steadily dissociated historical personages from theosophical truths. And the authority of names, whether in the past or in the present, from abstract principles. And she went on to express my mistrust of all appeal to authority and my conviction that no system having historical data and persons as its nuclei will ever successfully contend with time and criticism. I look with sorrow, she added, and concern on the growing tendency of the Theosophical Society to introduce into its method the superstitions, the exaggerated veneration for persons and for personal authority, an element which has been the ruin of every other religious system in the past, and the inevitable outcome of which is a mere servile hero worship, degenerating into the substitution of events for processes, of personalities for principles, of authority for reason, of history for experience. So, Theosophy's response to the Christmas message, as generally understood, is to suggest that it is not broad enough or profound enough. The tendency of most external religions to proclaim themselves superior to every other external religion is fatal to brotherhood, the first principle of our Theosophical Society, because it inevitably divides. Those within the community of believers are regarded, not least by themselves, as superior to those without. Indeed, those without may be threatened with eternal penalties. According to Luke's Gospel, a heavenly host appeared to the shepherds near where Jesus was born and declared, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." But peace and goodwill are not promoted by any exclusive claim to the truth that brings salvation. Some people may argue that it is belief in a personal God which leads to war and not peace. There's some truth in that. The history of theistic religion has often been a violent one. Madame Blavatsky argued forcefully against personal gods. In the Key to Theosophy and elsewhere, there's this bit of dialogue. "Do you believe in God?" asks the inquirer. And the Theosophist replies, "That depends on what you mean by the term." So the inquirer explains, "I mean the God of the Christians, the Father of Jesus, and the Creator, the biblical God of Moses, in short." And the Theosophist replies, "In such a God we do not believe. We reject the idea of a personal or an extra-cosmic and anthropomorphic God who is but the gigantic shadow of man, and not of man at his best either." The God of theology, we say, and prove it, is a bundle of contradictions and a logical impossibility. Therefore, we will have nothing to do with him. Now, Madame Blavatsky is the author of the book, The Key to Theosophy, which can be recommended as a highly readable exposition of theosophy as understood by HPB and her colleagues in 1889. So, Theosophy presents quite a challenge, doesn't it? First to the traditional account of Jesus, and also to the traditional understanding of a permanent God. Now, it goes without saying that no member of the Theosophical Society is obliged to accept any such assertion. People of all religions and of no religion can be found in the Theosophical Society. But what is widely taught in the Theosophical Society, and rightly so, is that there is what is variously called an ancient wisdom, a secret doctrine, or a golden thread, or a key which unlocks the public side of such celebrations as Christmas to disclose a mystical reality within. The Christmas message of Theosophy is a radical one. It challenges the whole basis of orthodox religious belief. Indeed, If we were to become Theosophists as Anna Kingsford understood Theosophy, we would give up the eating of turkeys and all other flesh. We're having a conference here on Saturday the 17th of February about Dr. Kingsford. But for the present, I would leave you with this suggestion, that we all examine what we understand the true Christian message to be, and wish each other a Merry Christmas. Thank you.